Hey guys, welcome to Voice of Reason with Nathan. As always, we are about knowing the Lord and making Him known. And in today's episode, I want to talk to you about the topic of worrying. And really, I want to give you an antidote to worry and something that's going to empower you to overcome that terrible state that we can find ourselves in from time to time, where we're ruminating, where we're looping, where we're feeling increased levels of stress and zoned in on that, and we're getting more and more anxious. You see, worrying, one of the impacts that it has is it focuses us, it gives us a tunnel vision, a narrow vision on that particular stressor. And by focusing in on it, if we're not careful, we can loop and get in this vicious cycle, and we're not actually resolving what the stress is. And that will perpetuate the cycle, and that will actually make us become more anxious and more stressed. And what happens in that place is we start to engage in the fight-flight response. And if we don't resolve what's causing that stress, if we don't come back to the antidote, which I'll give you in a second, we're going to find that we're just going to get more and more anxious and stressed out. And worrying, we do it because we actually do care about what's causing the worry, but we're doing it in an unhealthy way. And it's actually not going to resolve the issue at hand. And even, I must say, even with venting, even with, getting counseling, talking to friends, if you're actually not resolving what the stressor is, and you're just venting and you're just talking about it again and again, you're just going to be perpetuating the vicious cycle that you might find yourself in, unless you address and deal with that stressor. And now the antidote, here we go, ready? So instead of worrying, what I want you to do, and what I'm going to give you a strategy and a framework to do today, is to problem solve. And I know it's not that exciting. I know it's not maybe the miracle cure that you were hoping for, that I'll give you some phrase or some technique and you'll be like, yay, great, it's going to resolve all my worrying problems. But I'm telling you that this is a powerful antidote to worrying. This is something that's going to stop worrying in its tracks if you actually address what's going on. And I want to give you an acronym that I use, and I've helped empower the clients that work with me as a psychologist, and in my coaching mentoring program, we use this acronym called D.O.I.T. Do-it or do it, right? Do it, right? It's D.O.I.T. And the acronym, I'm going to go through the 4 steps now in how you can overcome that worrying vicious cycle that takes place. Ready? So the D stands for define, the O stands for options, the I stands for implement, and the T stands for test. Do it, right? So the D, define. What I want to talk to you about in defining phase, in the first step, is really about defining the problem. What's going on? All right, if as best as you can, you're looking at, okay, what's the stress? Where is this coming from? Go underneath the emotions of the anxiety and the stress and try to see what is the problem. Define the problem. And you must write it down. I always tell clients that if you don't write it down, it doesn't exist. It's all in your head. And if you can't take what's in here and write it down on a piece of paper, you won't be able to address it. Now, you might get to a point down the track where you do have the abilities and the capacity to sort things out in your mind, purely in your mind. You don't need to write things down all the time. But in terms of a worrying, vicious cycle that goes on, you do need to write it down, 100%. And that way you can actually address it and resolve what's going on. But before I go into that, number 1 is defining the problem, right? And really it's about looking at the facts of it, just where it started, just all the kind of like an observer, a reporter. You're just observing what's the problem at hand here. And be as clear and succinct and specific as you can be on what the problem is, right? Whether it's financial, relational, whether you're not communicating well enough, you're kind of really drilling deeper and deeper into what the actual problem is at hand. Number 2, O, right? So D-O-I-T, the O in that process is options. Defining your options, looking at what choices do I have here? What are my options? And you're brainstorming, right? You don't have to have necessarily the best option here. It's really about every and any option that you possibly can have, and it's about just, like for example, if you have a broken leg and you can't work out the way you were working out before, what options do you have, right? And you're not obviously going to say, I'm going to go for a run. You know, what other options do you have? You know, so it's about looking at what those options might be, what choices you do have, the can-dos versus the can't-dos, right? And so many people get caught up in that worrying, that vicious cycle, and they're zoned in, they're focused in on what they can't do versus what they can do, right? It's so important to know your options. And then the I, so D.O.I.T, I stands for implement. That's where you're putting into action that best option that you can come up with, right? So you've brainstormed, you've got a number of options, then you look at what's the best one that I can try right now. And it might not be, but we'll come to that in a moment. But you just, as best as you can, you're choosing what option you think is the most relevant, the most appropriate, the best option at that time, and that's where you implement it. You go ahead and do it. And another thing that might be useful in the O stage is weighing up those options, weighing up which ones, you know, say use a 10 out of 10 being this is the best option I think it's so important, it's relevant, it's the best, you know, and 0 being it's a miserable option, it's the worst option ever, I don't think it's beneficial, and 5 being somewhere in the middle. And you can actually weight those options. So one option might be an 8 out of 10, another one might be a 10 out of 10, and so you're doing a bit of a cost benefits analysis in that as well. I don't want to get too technical with it because I think that it can also procrastinate people and not, you know, using this technique. But at the same time, I want to give you that little side tip or side tool that you can use on those options. So the I is when we implement it, you go for it, you put it into action, and then the T, the final step, is about test. You got to test it. Did it work? You evaluate. You know, if it worked, it's a yes. Tick it off. Great. You keep moving forward. You know, fantastic. If it's a no, you go back to the start. You go back to the D. Go back to defining. You repeat that cycle until you find a solution that's successful. And it's really about just that process, that journey. You know, there's not rocket science, but it's so simple, but still so difficult to do when we are caught up in that worrying cycle. And the other thing that might be useful in that options phase, you might need to get help to figure out, okay, what are my options? You might be in such a state that you're not able to think clearly in that moment. So that can be useful where you are talking and opening up to someone about it, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a friend, whether it's, you know, even yourself sometimes, you know, it can be beneficial to talk it out loud if you're a verbal processor. And writing down, of course, you're able to actually see what's going on. And so that's where it can be useful. But again, it's not useful in just venting, just, you know, sharing how you feel and you feel and you feel. You're not actually drilling down into, okay, how can I be solution focused here? And on the flip side to that as well, it is important to have a place where you can just share how you feel at times. And by doing that, it actually helps to clear your head and you get clarity. You know, this world doesn't need great thinking and these amazing ideas. Honestly, I believe we really just need clear thinking. And through the clarity of thought, we're able to implement amazing processes and amazing things that will transform and change the planet for the benefit of what God's called us to. You know, so clear thinking is so essential. So absolutely, there's a place to share your feelings and what's going on, but with the idea of that we're moving through it. And I've done a video on that recently as well, in, you know, emotional honesty and how we can do that effectively. So I hope that helps, guys. Just to summarize all of that, D.O.I.T, do it, D.O.I.T, define options, implement, and then test it. And if it works, awesome, you move along. If it doesn't, great, you go back to the start, define options, implement, and test it. And so I hope this helps you to give you a bit of a framework on how you can have an antidote to worrying, how you can break that vicious cycle and you can start to problem solve in a successful, in an awesome way. Bless you guys.